You are Timothy Brittain-Catlin, Dr. Timothy Brittain-Catlin, I should say. You are a reader in architecture at the University of Kent, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
That's correct. And your focus of study has been predominantly on neo-Gothic architecture, is that also correct?
Not exactly. It's been, to be very specific about it, it's been about what happens to the architectural profession and to architectural practice at times of change. So the Gothic Revival was probably the biggest single moment of change for the practice of architecture. Bigger, I think, than the move to modernism from the late 1930s onwards. And it's also a theme that can be picked up at other intervals. For example, during the Edwardian period, when architecture changed very dramatically and produced probably the only architecture in Britain until the high-tech period that was of international interest and significance. And indeed, it changed again in the early, or the 1950s, I would say. And now, of course, it's changed again in the light of more or less the collapse of most modernist dogma and replacement by something else, which seems to include postmodernism to it. So it's those moments of big change that interest me. And what Bleak Houses was about is what happens to the people on the losing side, because the Gothic Revival produced a lot of losers. It produced a lot of people whose careers drew to an end fairly quickly because they weren't part of the ruling group, or the group that got the jobs and made the most noise. And the Gothic Revival was, one of the things that's very distinct about it is that the Gothic Revival was run by very young and very keen and very enthusiastic people, and those who had become architects in the Regency and the late Georgian period were not really able to cope with the onslaught that was poured on top of their heads. So it was a very difficult time for many people, and in order to succeed in that period, you had to be not only following the latest tenets of what the Gothic Revivalists, the ecclesiologists, to be exact, wanted. If you wanted to get a decent job and get a decent hearing, not only did you have to do that, but you had to do it precisely. So there were victims too who tried to be Gothic Revivalists and didn't quite get it, and were rubbished from one end to the other. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that what I had assumed was the case, and the research for that book certainly proved it, was that the pro-modernists from the 1930s, at any rate, onwards, used almost exactly the same tactics as the Gothic Revivalists had done. The principal tactic was to rubbish completely people who didn't comply with what they wanted. That's to say, to try to destroy them as an enemy by perpetually rubbishing everything that they did. This was invented essentially by the ecclesiologists. Pugin might have been responsible for it, but at least he had wit, and he didn't on the whole address large crowds of people. But the people who followed, and in fact, to be fair to them, the principal architects that we associate with the Gothic Revival, with Street and Butterfield and Kilbert and Scott and so on, they didn't do it either. But the ecclesiological movement, which sometimes is described as the most successful student group that's ever existed, which brought about complete change in church architecture over the course of the 19th century, so that it bore no relation at the end of the 19th century to what it had done pre-Pugin. Those people were aggressive and assertive people. Modernists learnt from them. They did the same things precisely. The idea was that if you weren't part of that gang, then you were out of it.
Mm. So what exactly was it in terms of the transition between pre-Gothic Revival and Gothic Revival? Because I think a lot of people are fairly aware of the sort of the shift to modernism, perhaps because it's a more recent thing, but perhaps because it's more relevant because modernism has sort of perpetuated over that time. What was the state of affairs before the Gothic Revival came along, and sort of what were the series of events that caused it to occur?
I have a different view about the origins of the Gothic Revival from most people. There is a wide view that the Gothic Revival was a kind of culmination of some sort of romantic, picturesque, nationalist feeling expressed across all kinds of forms of culture in novels and books and in history writing and so on, and that this was architects following along with their own thing. Now, that will have been an element for sure, but I don't think that it was the key element. What the Gothic Revival was doing essentially was it was trying to respond to the extraordinarily bad standards of design and construction in particular in architecture There were a series of scandals in building in the 1820s and 1830s which had shown that architects couldn't cope with what was required of them. These scandals were overspending scandals. The most famous example is Buckingham Palace, where Parliament began to ask itself what had happened to all the money that it had been chucking at this project, which seemed to be never finished and was inadequate in many ways, and also funny to look at. It's one of the few buildings where people actually laughed at it when they saw the egg-like dome at the back of it. So that was that. There were a lot of public building projects going on. There was a lot of military work in the 1820s after Napoleon, for example, and the British government decided that it wouldn't award any contracts to anybody unless they could agree a price in advance, and that the tenderer would stick to that price. Now, architects were not in any position to cope with this, nor were they in any position to cope with the technological demands that were being put on them for things as simple as kitchens, for example. Very difficult for an architect of a small house in the 1820s, 1830s to know what to do with all the kitchen stuff and all the, you can't quite say bathroom stuff at that point, but you can certainly say plumbing. Houses will have, a house of quality will have water closets by 1840. There is heating, there is ventilating and so on, and they didn't have the first idea of what to do with it. And you see in many designs for houses, and the ones I've looked at have been parsonage houses because these have got very complete sets of plans in many cases, that they're hiding the kitchens round the back or dressing them up not to look like kitchens, or maybe not even drawing them at all in their plans because they don't know what to do with it. The Gothic Revival kills all these birds with one stone, because what Pugin is essentially saying is that you should be able to understand from looking at a building how it stands up, what everything is, how everything is related to each other. It doesn't say it in that kind of modern language, but what is very clear, and what he does do, is talk about the coherence of the whole thing. The whole building is conceived together, and it works itself into providing solutions for modern problems. He says, quite rightly, for example, in his book An Apology, that first of all he says that all houses should be designed to suit the circumstances of modern life, generated the peculiar circumstances or something is the phrase that he uses. So the house has to be like a house is needed to be, not like a medieval house of any kind. The other thing he talks about in the same book, it's the book in which he addresses things that aren't churches, essentially, and he talks about shops. And he shows in a drawing how a Gothic form of construction can provide you with a perfectly acceptable, from an aesthetic point of view, let alone a constructional point of view, a row of shop fronts without it looking peculiar or irregular. He would have said that in part because he knew Nash's Regent Street quadrant, for example, where the windows didn't look right. They were too small, and then they had to put the colonnade, they'd take away the colonnade in the end. There was a mess going on, basically. There was a compromise and a mess in order to try to get modern shop fronts into a high-quality building. And the Gothic solved this, like it solved modern houses. You can do a kitchen. There are wonderful medieval kitchens. Do a medieval kitchen in your modern house, and you will find you've got space for everything, and you don't have to be embarrassed about it. The single architectural event that tells you more than anything else is in Pugin's own house, the Grange in Ramsgate, where you approach that building down the side of the back of the kitchen. And a Georgian architect would have done anything to avoid this situation. The kitchen itself would have been hidden around the side or the back or something. In Pugin's case, you run along the back of the scullery and the back of the kitchen before arriving at the front door, because there's no longer any feeling that architecture can't deal with some things. It can deal with everything. It's a very, very significant moment for architects everywhere, that they can give up struggling with what modern life demands of them and answer it well with a Gothic solution. So that, to my mind, is what the Gothic Revival is about. And of course, if you are looking at every element of a building as being expressive of what it does, sometimes exaggerating what it does, like a very steep roof exaggerating what it does, then of course you can itemize them, and you can go out to tender and get an accurate price. Now, which comes first, I don't know, but my feeling is that that's the situation in the architectural profession that Pugin is addressing. He was venerated by other architects for, amongst other things, restoring the status of the architect as the person who made all the major decisions And to be the person who makes all the major decisions, you've got to be in control of all of them and know how to deal with them. So that, I think, is what the Gothic Revival is really about. I don't think it's to do with like ghosts and castles and ruined abbeys and things at all, really.
Yeah, I remember you when you were talking about the Grange previously. I don't know whether you've said it explicitly, but you talked about where you got sort of everything comes off of one central hall space.
Yes,
and it's an emergent plan out of the function of the building, rather than, say, a Palladian example of where you have a specific box that you have to fill in a certain set of ways.
That. Yes,
and sort of from a more theoretical point of view, I've and having written about this previously, I sort of see Gothic and consequently Gothic Revival as an emergent philosophy in architecture, effectively. That it's obviously a cliche to say form follows function, but it comes out of what the building has to do and how it's oriented and how it's fulfilling the function that you want it to fulfill, rather than sort of a top-down imposed view of the theory of the philosophy behind it. So was there any aspect that leading up to the Gothic Revival in terms of a philosophical change or a political change or a sort of general theoretical change as to why people felt that this direction was the way to go at that point in time?
Yes, there are. There are a lot of specific reasons. I would say that what happened was that pre-Pugin, architects were turning a diagram into a plan, whereas what the Pugin people are doing is turning a plan into a diagram. This is what I mean by that. The pre-Pugin houses are boxes, essentially, single pile houses, double pile houses, a simple box for all kinds of sensible reasons, the minimum number of external walls, the simplest roof, and so on. And then you then divide that diagrammatic box up into form a plan and try to fill it out with rooms. As you know, students in early stages of design do this a lot. They have their outside shape and then they try and fit the rooms in. That's what's going on. Pugin is turning a plan into a diagram in the sense that what he's doing is he's laying it out to suit his own purposes, the purposes of the brief, and what you end up with is a building whose plan represents the different priorities of the architect. Now, let me give you some examples of that. I'll take first of all the simple pinwheel plan, which is what we say because we don't want to say swastika plan, of Pugin's own houses. In these pinwheel plans, the rooms revolve around a central hall so that each long axis of each wing is at right angles to the one that is next to it. So it does end up looking a bit like a swastika. This makes the house, first of all, very expressive from the outside. When you stand outside one of these houses, you need only look up at the gables as they rotate to work out precisely how the house is standing up. So it's carrying out this expressive, constructional, technological message of the Gothic Revival that I was talking about first. That's the first thing it's doing. The second thing that Pugin was doing was that I think that he was exaggerating the movement between the rooms. You can see this a bit in where he positions the doors. In the Grange, for example, the dining room door could be a lot closer to the sitting room door, but it isn't. And that's in order for the architect to impose their idea of how you should move about the house. Pugin himself is a great believer in processions. He saw it as a kind of Catholic thing. He did it in his own home. And by stretching out these lengths, you are engaging more with the house itself. The house can do more for you. Now, in a house, that sounds fairly vague, but in a building such as a religious institution, it's not at all vague. Pugin designed a series of convents where the walking through the building is an enormously important part of it. There's a very striking example in Nottingham where Pugin designed his finest convent, in my opinion, where there is a modest front door. In fact, it's a building about which a lot can be said. It's a very, very striking building. I think it's extraordinary to think of something like that going up in the late 1840s. You are confronted with a small entrance door. If you were very tall, or if you were carrying a long stick, you could touch the wall above left of where you're standing, and you would be on the outside of what they called Our Lady's Cloister, which was meant to be the innermost contemplative space in the monastery. It's right by the front door. But to get from the front door to it on the inside, you have to go all the way through the whole length of the building, and then up to the floor above, and then all the way back again. Now, Pugin is doing this as an architect because it's giving you a lot more building for your money. Let's say by stretching out the inside, the building feels bigger than it is. But what it's also doing is it's also giving a different character. each arm of the cloister or the corridor which you are walking through. He used cloisters a lot. He uses the word cloister sometimes to refer even to quite a small piece of corridor if he wants you to go there. I can think of one very small house where he calls it, for example, where he calls about 10 foot less, I think, probably, a cloister. There's a lot of writing in the Catholic press at this time as to what the code of behaviour should be in new monastic institutions, and how those who live there should have a different attitude and a different frame of mind from when they're in their community room, in the chapel, in the refectory, in the parlour, and so on. How their mood, their attitude should be different. It's quite overstated, but you'd expect that to be the case because the great interest of the 1840s, I suppose, is positivism. That's to say, detailing, quantifying experiences of life as far as possible. So those who are interested in the behaviour of people and the behaviour in institutions are describing in some detail what exactly those people should be doing, what they should be wearing, and what they should be thinking at any one point. And Pugin is building his buildings around this. Very long cloister sequences, often with different windows, different walls, different roof structures.
Well, I was in the Palace of Westminster the other day, and you get that feeling, even though they're not explicitly cloisters, you do get that, like you say, processional feeling of moving between spaces. And obviously, of course, Barry was involved in the actual planning of the building. But the sort of the sense that you get that you are entering different voids, different spaces, and then different processions or corridors between them is a very strong sense. And I guess Pugin's detailing was a large part of that.
One of the weirdest ones of all is that at Cotton College, Pugin designed I can't remember if it was a school or a seminary originally. I think it might have been a seminary originally, and a church off it, St Wilfrid's Church. And the Countess of Shrewsbury, that's to say the wife of his best patron, herself donated some money for a cloister between the main seminary building and the church itself. And in order to go through the building into the church, you change angle about 3 or 4 times. It's clearly not necessary for any function, but it's evidently was liturgically or religiously necessary in order to experience the building in the way in which Pugin wanted you to do it. So some of it comes simply from cheap building. You can get quite a grand building by doing very large amounts of cloister and corridor and so on. But some of it, and the more interesting part of it, is an architectural expression of something that is much wider and is going on in society, which is a much higher expectation of exactness and precision in aspects of life and how to deal with them and how to reflect them. There is a wonderful convent in Cheadle in Staffordshire, which is where Pugin's finest church is, and any normal architect would have built a cube-shaped building in the garden as the convent to go with it. But Pugin instead smears his building all the way along the edge of the site, so that if the Sisters of Mercy are going to walk from the church to their community room at the back of the convent building, converted building, which Pugin enormously extended, they have to walk something like 60 metres to get there, as opposed to probably less than 10 if they went in a straight line. So he
sounds like Norman Foster's Apple Campus.
Well, yes, it does a bit. It's the 1840s version, and but it shows you also how the architect can dominate the experience of a building, and that is one of the things that made Pugin so venerated, I think, was that no longer being a person who drew up things at, what we would now call 1 to 50, there, instead of being one of those people, it was the person who controlled every single aspect of it and whose genius lay in making sure that all those aspects form one single coherent method. You have to be a genius designed to do it. He wasn't a normal person. He did tens of thousands of drawings for the Palace of Westminster on his own, and that's just one thing he was doing, and he was hardly paid for it. He had a photographic memory for details of churches. John Hubman Powell, who worked for him, said that he never saw him once repeat a detail. He could always think of another one. Before Pugin came along, there were about 6 patterns, Gothic patterns that people used, trefoils and quatrefoils and so on, and cusps and so on. This was transformed into so many different details that you could use a different one every day for the whole of your life, and you can work out when he was doing them, how quickly he was doing them by looking at his diary, which tells you where he was going. So it is a staggering achievement. It's not representative of anything that any normal person can do, But what it did have with it was it did have a very exciting message for architects who were bored of the really quite boring architecture. It's quite charming very often, but mostly quite boring architecture of the 1830s.
No, I think it's interesting that you mentioned this idea of the architect becoming the central figure again, because I think there's almost a similar argument going on now in terms of the role of the architect and the marginalisation of the architect. So was that something that was happening before Pugin came along, before the Gothic Revival? Was the architect becoming a more marginalised figure back then as well?
I think, yes, architects have never been anything much other than marginal, but they were more marginalised than ever been before, because if your incompetence is repeatedly shown up in public as buildings collapse and the foundations fell down or the roof collapsed or the House of Parliament ended in embarrassment for everyone, all these things going on, then you are very vulnerable. And we know from being in Bloomsbury that Mr. Cubitt, the builder, is saying to his clients, why do you want these prima donnas? All they do is they just cause trouble. My brother Lewis sits in the back office, can draw out what you want quickly. We will tell you what it will cost, and that is what it will cost. It threatens the architectural profession because on the whole, it's great sadness of life for us architects is that most people don't really care what buildings look like, unfortunately. So if the builder
at least not at a conscious level.
No, not at a conscious level, or probably not even, sometimes just not at all, full stop. So if the builder says, I will knock this up and that's it, then and it will cost you less and you won't have to deal with some, la-di-da person, then they think, great, we'll bring it on. And that is, of course, what was going on. The late Georgian period is the great period of the speculative builder. Building development is very sophisticated in England for historical reasons, and therefore there are a lot of very efficient clients who can get builders to design things and put them up for them in an efficient way, and the architects certainly in danger of being marginalised in this. So that's why it brought the architectural profession back to life, there's no question about it. And I think also that possibly, the modernists thought that they would go the same way, to try to make cult figures of the big people behind it, and also to reinvent their history hugely, as we all know.
Was there a sort of a strong aspect of ego to it as well? Like Pugin strikes me, like you say, he wasn't a normal person in any traditional sense of normal. But was that sort of sense of the egotistical architect, almost a stereotype, I guess, was that a strong element in his sort of philosophy in returning to this central idea of the architect?
It was. He thought that architects were important people and they should look and sound like important people. That for sure he thought that. He did say words to the effect of, I can't do everything. He does say, literally, I have the whole of the Gothic Revival on my shoulders. I've got a lot of important things to do. So he's not going to turn up at the RIBA or the government art schools, all the places, although he kind of did marginally, but he's not going to go down that route of defining the architectural profession as part of his job. But it follows from everything that he did that the architect has become a much more powerful person. What happens, the reason probably for the success of the ecclesiologists in picking up the Gothic Revival and running with it, is the increasing power of churchmen during the course of the 19th century, because they are the people with the money for the churches. They are the big clients. That's why they're producing such fine architecture in England, because they can see, the churchmen themselves can see the value of a high quality building for a lot of reasons. It's a very prominent building, everybody can see it. It's a very expensive building, then people will value it. If it has some element of being a community project to it, and they probably were, because people had to raise money for these churches, it's not coming out of nowhere, then that also is a positive thing. If you are competing with the nonconformist churches, with the Roman Catholics and so on, these are all reasons why you should spend a lot of money on a prominent church building. If you can also do the thing that caused modernists such excitement, but which in reality is slightly different, and that is claim that this is a moral way of building, then you are just winning on every front. So that is, perhaps it's a glib way of putting it, but it's not an inaccurate way of saying how it was that Britain acquired, England for sure, acquired such a staggeringly rich range and variety of new church buildings and restored church buildings in the 19th century. It's said that something like 96% of England's medieval churches were restored in the 19th century. There are a whole lot of new ones. So it's a powerful thing that's going on. Pugin was aware, architects were aware, that in the Middle Ages, when Gothic buildings went up, they were by far and away the most sophisticated thing in existence technologically, compared to anything else that those people were living in their mud huts and throwing, lumps of lead and fire at each other. That in those days, the design and construction of a building was the most sophisticated thing that there could possibly be. Look at medieval structures now, and it's easy to feel astonished by how sophisticated that is compared to how people lived and worked most of the time. And so there is a feeling also that you want to get back to that point where the architect is in control of the sophisticated technology and the budget to do it. It's one of many similarities between the Gothic Revival and the high-tech movement, for example, which is expensive, sophisticated technical stuff which most people can't really understand.
Well, to that extent, does the Gothic and Gothic Revival only really lend itself, therefore, to public buildings or singular prominent buildings that have perhaps higher budgets, or where quality is put in a more important place than sort of units or cost per square metre or anything?
You could do it. One of the objections to the Gothic Revival in the early days was that it was going to be more expensive than building a cheap brick box commissioner's church of the kind that was going up in the early decades of the century. But Pugin faced this time and time again, said, no, it isn't necessarily true. Gothic building is not necessarily more expensive. What he used to say was that you can put in, once you've got the bones right, you can put in the other stuff and extend it and enlarge it later, because a Gothic building isn't, of course, symmetrical, doesn't have to be finished or look finished. All these things that classical buildings do have to be. You can't build one half of a symmetrical front, not the other half. Gothic doesn't have those problems. Just make it smaller and then extend it. That was one thing he said. But it's also true that these convent buildings I've been talking about were fantastically cheap buildings. In fact, it makes it even more striking that so much of such small budgets was spent on these long corridor spaces. They're really cheap, these things. They're brick boxes with holes pierced in them. And they can demonstrate how you can get enormous grandeur from knowing how to control space properly. Pugin said, about the only really helpful thing he ever said about himself was that he learnt everything from having been a stage set builder at the Covent Garden Theatre, a thing that's now rebuilt, of course, it's now the Royal Opera House. This was a job he did when he was young, and it's a very profoundly accurate comment, because he knew that you can make a building look bigger and grander by having the light come from the right direction at the right moment, just as stage set designers get depth on stage by doing exactly the same thing. The lady who used to live in Pugin's best rectory house at Rampisham, as it's now called, in Dorset, which is a fabulous house, and the one where he got everything right, said the thing about that house was that the whole life of the house changed throughout the day as the light crept through it with articulated corridors and so on. It just does staggering things. That's a stage set designer's knack that he incorporated into his architectural design. And that's not expensive. It was an expensive building, but not because of that. Yeah,
you definitely get a sense of the theatrical when you're in his buildings, but I don't know whether that's just because we're not used to those kinds of buildings anymore, or that kind of detailing. So what was it that stopped Gothic Revival architecture from spreading more widely and from leaching into more domestic architecture or mass housing or anything like that in the same way that Georgian did?
It slightly did more than you might think. When I looked at parsonage houses of the early 19th century, because the records are so good, as opposed to any other kind of detached house where they hardly ever exist, or at any rate not where you can find them easily. And what is very clear is that architects everywhere, from the north coast of Northumberland to the south coast of Cornwall, started copying bits out of these early Pugin houses straight away. You get one very specific phenomenon, a very surprising one, is that people with Georgian houses with very conventional and stiff floor layouts, a narrow corridor hall, the rooms either side is the most common one, would start to rebuild the inside of their houses so that they had stair halls in the Pugin sense. So they were very widely copied. I don't know how it happened. I've no idea how it happened, but too much of it happened for it to be a coincidence, in that people did choose a lot of different themes and take them further all over the place. So it's true that it's difficult to think of big Gothic houses. There are houses. There's only one house of any real size by Gilbert Scott, Kelham, in Nottinghamshire, there are houses by Burgess, which are bigger than parsonages, but they didn't, on the whole, do houses. It might have been because they were essentially church architects who only did a house when somebody asked them, exceptionally. Did it reach ordinary terraced housing? Well, it did a bit, I think. It's worth remembering that many Georgian houses were really badly built. And a lot of things...
Tell me about it.
Yeah, right. Well, and a lot of things are going on throughout the 19th century to improve the standard of building construction, and they are sometimes the London Building Acts, insisting on increasingly raising the standards of party walls and room sizes and so on. So a bit of that is going on at the same time. So it may not have come off the Gothic Revival, but for sure it comes out of the same motives as the Gothic Revival, which is to be much more rational and organised and scientific about the design of buildings. So that is happening. They don't look very Gothic, but then Pugin's houses actually they don't have pointy windows. Pugin himself said you don't have a sitting room window that looks like a church, because you're not in a church, you're in a sitting room.
There's almost a contradiction from what I can see, because Gothic is a very vertical style, effectively, or sense of building, and it obviously lends itself to ecclesiastical architecture, cathedrals, churches, because of that. And that the domestic has always been a more horizontal realm, generally, and therefore lends itself less well, perhaps, to Gothic architecture as a style.
Yeah, sure. Pugin's houses, his own houses, when I look at people copying Pugin, which I had to do many years ago in the 1840s and 1850s, what they tended to do was to horizontalize his own designs. So a house would look very much like the Grange, for example, but the difference was that the architect had used various tricks to make it seem more horizontal, string courses and that kind of thing, to emphasize the horizontality of it, which must have been seen as being English in some way. Pugin's houses are not really Gothic at all. They are Jacobean. They would have hated anyone to say it, but it is the case, is that if they look like anything, and they don't look, in fact, you wouldn't mistake one for a Jacobean house, unlike, for example, an Edwardian Jacobean house. You might easily mistake it for a genuine Jacobean one, but you wouldn't mistake a Pugin one because of the form of the building overall is completely different, the layout is completely different, and there isn't any attempt to look Jacobean. But Jacobean is what they are, if you look at the details of them, if you look at the windows of them and so on. But you're right, he was a great believer in verticality as being the thing that gave architecture importance, and he says that's the spiral form, by which he doesn't mean an actual spiral, he means the form of a spire. This is the thing that distinguishes, as he would call it, Christian architecture. There's nothing to suppose that he was particularly interested in houses, and there's not that much to suppose that the other major Gothic Revival architects were that interested in houses. So they may have done very good ones, but they didn't talk about them or explain them or justify them very much. In the case of, there's quite a sad story where Pugin gets attacked by these vicious ecclesiologists later on, and one of the things that they attack is the clergy house where the bishop lives in Nottingham, which is adjacent between, in fact, the cathedral, St Barnabas, which is one of his great buildings, and the wonderful convent I was talking about earlier. And he says, well, it was just a cheap house, is what he says. It doesn't even try to defend what is, in fact, quite an unusual building. So they weren't that interested in it. Now, this changes towards the end of the 19th century, when basically most of the churches have been done, and the money to build is accumulated in different sorts of hands. And so towards the end of the 19th century, you get, as you know, people increasingly spending absolutely enormous amounts on very high-quality houses. Those people, many of them, were great enthusiasts for Pugin, but I've never come across any of them saying anything about Pugin and houses, especially. It's more Pugin, the general idea, rather than Pugin designed as
So was he the sort of the pioneer of the Gothic Revival movement, or did he have followers around him, or was he sort of taking something that someone else had started and developing it further?
No, he did it. And that's why we have it, and the Belgians have it, because there was a circle of Pugin admirers in Bruges with an architect who was may not have had Pugin's great genius, but was certainly a very competent Gothic architect called Bethune at their centre. And that's why if you go on the Eurostar into Belgium, you'll know when you've gone from France into Belgium, because suddenly you get what you look like proper parish churches, because they've been restored and Gothic revivaled. But you do get, there is a distinct Gothic revival in Belgium, and there isn't really anywhere else. And that's, I suppose, some tribute to him as a person. I don't know to what extent you've come across this, but if you study the history of 19th century architecture at a European school, it's all completely different. It didn't have the Gothic Revival, really. They all learn about Semper. Nobody here knows anything about Semper, because Pugin is more interesting, basically. And you can see the effects from every window, whereas you can't so much with Semper, I would say.
So what happened towards the end of the Gothic Revival then? What drove people to either become tired of it? Because I understand that it sort of got out of hand, effectively, and there was in the Edwardian period.
Yeah, I think people get bored. You move on to the next generation. Gilbert Scott's son, known always as George Gilbert Scott Jr., was a very able Gothic architect and restorer. Did some very fine buildings in Cambridge, which are sometimes attributed to the father, but in fact it was the son who did them. But he starts building houses in a Queen Anne style at a certain point. Maybe it's to annoy admirers of his father. Maybe he just wants something else. I think people get bored. These things go round in circles. People do get bored of styles. It's a generational thing involved in it, I would say. Very few of some of Pugin's great end-of-the-century admirers are particularly imitating his church stuff, Pearson, I suppose. But those people who are young or youngish, 30 to 40, young for architects, in 1900, they are 2 generations away from Pugin now. So they can react against the people who are reacting against Pugin and bring it back again, I would say.
Yeah. And then obviously we transitioned into the modernist period through various means. But you talk about people getting bored, but modernism effectively has been around for effectively 100 years now.
Yes.
In its various forms. And obviously there have been reactions against it temporarily with postmodernism. But where do you sort of see architectural theory being at now in terms of a status, and where do you think it might go in the sort of coming years?
I can only really talk about the British situation, I suppose. The British are very untheoretical and sometimes anti-intellectual in their discussion of buildings. Again, it marks out what Pugin and the Gothic Revivalists are doing, which can be talked about entirely, as I've tried to do, in pragmatic terms. This is different from what the French and the Germans and so on are doing, where there's a kind of intellectual basis to it, right? There isn't in England. There isn't any intellectual basis to it. It is what it is. That's a completely English phenomenon, I think. And that's always the case, whatever period we are at. And people don't much now talk about the theory or the intellectual theory of architecture. The word theory, of course, carries particular connotations. Nothing was more surprising to me than that the MIT Press should be generous enough to publish my book, because in a way that book is very much in opposition to a line that the great editor Roger Conover took for 20 years or so about promoting architectural theory. And I'm pretty in that book, a pretty anti-theory thing, because it's the buildings that
This is your book, Bleak Houses.
That's the book, Bleak Houses. Now, the book, Bleak Houses, has this British anti-theory thing in it. And theory carries with it nowadays a particular connotation of a certain kind of intellectual conversation about buildings. It was mainly going on in the United States, I think, in the 1990s, 2000s a bit, and slightly ebbed away at the moment. So theory within inverted commas is different from theory. There is very little. The place where architectural theory without the inverted commas went living on is in architectural education. And in fact, it's really only in architectural education that this funny, blunt, old modernist approach still exists, that you still find, for example, books by Rayner Banham, great as he is, on a reading list as if it had any practical application of any sort whatsoever. Of course, a writer like Banham, like a writer like Frampton, has got a certain historical value as a person recording opinions at a certain period. But the idea that this should be a textbook for somebody seems to me to be clearly absurd. It's a long time ago now. It can't be true that the things that architects were, that a certain very small group of fringe people in the 1920s were trying to do can be of that much relevance to anything, really, that architects address today.
Well, do you think there are sort of eternal truths in architecture that transcend time periods?
What I think is that there are two types of architectural personality. There is bluntly, in simple terms, there is a Gothic type and there is a classical type. There are people who are not bothered by buildings being not finished, or by being rough, or by being mysterious in some way, or of reflecting the stuff that they're made of, or of representing what goes on inside. There are those kind of people and there are those kind of buildings. Those kind of people tend to like those kind of buildings. Just as there are, in opposition to that, there's a classical kind of person who likes their building to be finished, to be ordered, to be proportionate, to have clear allegorical value, who isn't bothered by what it's actually made of. For example, David Watkin always used to say that all buildings are artificial things. They didn't grow out of the ground. So therefore you shouldn't be embarrassed about the fact that it's made out of some man-made component, because the whole thing is man-made to start with. It's a perfectly reasonable argument. So I think that the division into types and approaches is certainly always there. I don't think that any of the rest of it is especially always there, I don't think. The modernists, like the Gothic revivalists, very happy to come back to my favourite theme again. The modernists' form of attack was to rubbish anybody else, as if to say that nothing other than the true cult is an accepted way of teaching. They were teaching like this in this building in the 1980s, as I'm well aware, and I don't suppose they still are, but it's not really that long ago that they were still doing this, that there was only one way in which you could design, and if you didn't, then there was something wrong with you as a person. That was generally the line that was adopted. How the particular style of the buildings, the particular theoretical approach of those people, of course, changes from generation to generation, doesn't stay the same. But the attitudes, the Gothic and the classical attitudes, for one, and this kind of groupthink cult attitude for another, those things go on reoccurring in every generation in new forms.
Well, I've sort of been wondering recently about why it is that classicism has this sort of cult following amongst a very small number of people, and why that doesn't apply to whether it's Gothic or any other historical styles.
Yeah, it is odd, isn't
and
it?
And I think you're right in to touch on the idea of this sort of almost utopian, perfect idea of, or maybe Arcadian idea of an ideal city that's built of these classical elements. And maybe that doesn't, like you say, relate to a more Gothic philosophy, which I would call emergent, and that doesn't fit the sort of the perfect, symmetrical, laid out narrative.
I think that in this country it reflects the basic English cultural divide between the Puritans and the hedonists, basically. That's what it does. So those people who want to wind up the Puritans will go very strongly the other way. And I'm sure that the late David Watkin, for whom I have a great deal of respect, was right really in much of what he said, that quite a lot of what motivated David was to annoy the po-faced sanctimonious Puritans with their straight lines and their bossy morality. He just didn't like it. And there are other people maybe who do that as well. Why they should necessarily have landed on classical architecture, I don't know, but it's to do with that, I think. It's not only to do with that. There are some practitioners of classical-looking architecture who are first-rate designers and architects who would have done well in every generation. There are some classical architects, I won't name some of them because there are now quite a few. I can start with a graduate of this school about the same time as me, John Simpson, but the buildings that are produced by Ben Pentreath, by Craig Hamilton, and by several others are really astonishingly high quality and are not the result of wanting to annoy other people. But the business about wanting to annoy other people, that battle, as you know, that cultural divide, it goes right across English society. It always has done.
Do you think the modernists, so far as that's a homogenous group, fit into that sort of Puritan idea, or is that?
Yeah, totally, absolutely, they do.
Yeah.
I was very struck by there was an exchange on Twitter that I was very struck by from the modernists against the postmodernists, and this was, I can't remember what the circumstances were exactly, but what was going on here was that the modernist critics, who were young people, they seem young to me anyway, who are young people, were deriding the fact that the 20th century society had successfully managed to prevent the number one poultry, the James Sterling building, from being mutilated on the ground floor. There was a nation of shopkeepers type of idea to fill in the arcades, for example, which would have changed the proportion of it. And straight away, these people, young people, came out with the arguments, oh, it's all about, should there be, I think the expression they used was, should there be a Pret in the lobby? Whereas our architecture, our modernist architecture, is noble stuff to do with housing the poor and so on. But that's just the English cultural divide right in front of your face. You can't make a judgment about a building as whether it fits in with this or that imaginary Labour Party programme, I don't think. It's to be a daft thing to do. Buildings are, as David Watkin would say, they're things that people make. They aren't, they don't really carry with them all that stuff. The most successful of the mass public housing that was built in the 1950s was totally Swedish in style. It wasn't remotely brutalist. It was very nice. It was pretty. It was copied off Swedish housing, which I don't know enough about the politics of that really, but what I know for sure is the official attitude was that this is an architecture of being nice to people. And so it was often, pretty is very often what it was. It's very striking that you don't hear the modernist critics ever saying how great that was, but that housed many more people far better than the brutalist buildings. Brutalist buildings are fantastic and exciting sculptures sometimes, but sometimes a lot of them are simply disgusting. The front of Dennis Lasdon's housing at Christ's College in Cambridge looks wonderful, even though there was a mountain of technical problems with it. The back of it was beyond disgusting originally. There was the dustbins and the turning circles and this, that, and the next thing. And the idea that somehow you have to accept it because it's part of this heroic way of serving society is essentially a daft one, I think. In the end, they infilled the back of it with a brick thing, a comic brick thing that's got Gothic decorations on it. So you have these two things sitting together.
Well, I think it's interesting what you mentioned earlier about Gothic being able to be adapted and added to more easily because of the sort of the way it's constructed and not having the same sort of symmetrical constraints that Classicism has. And I think you can see this in the examples. I was looking at Lutyens' houses the other day when he's, I don't know, it's not Gothic Revival, but adding onto something that's 400 years older, and you can barely tell the difference because it's continuing the same sort of philosophy. And like you say, it doesn't fit that symmetrical ideal. So I think, in terms of again, trying to link this back to the sort of theoretical side of it, do you think there's a strong political element in the advocation of certain styles or ways of building over others? Are there sort of political groups that match quite closely with architectural groups, effectively?
There is, to some extent, at any given point, some degree of exploitation of the architectural profession by political attitudes. I think you could certainly say that. But there isn't any necessary connection, I don't think, at all between the two. There's no particular reason why there should be. It's not really quite good enough to look at classical buildings and say this is the architecture of palaces and therefore it's no use to most people. It isn't really true in practice. In any case, most buildings nowadays don't fit into any particular category at all, which is a shame, I think. I think that the thing that is missing, the thing that modernism succeeded in destroying, was the continuity of historical knowledge. There are plenty of examples of excellent architects who design buildings using ideas which are essentially drawn from different historical periods. They may or they may not be conscious of doing it. The building by Brittain-Catlin de la Peña, the Flint House for the Rothschild, this is essentially a medieval type of building, I think. Stephen Taylor has designed houses that have a medieval feeling about them, that obviously come from a lot of knowledge. One architect who knows a ton about historical building and is very aware of it and the use of it is Charles Holland. I think that Charles's house for Essex with Grayson Perry, for example, looks to me like a building of the 1830s when the English are investigating what their symbolism means and trying to do it through existing church structures. He doesn't think that's the case. He thinks it's something else, but I don't think that matters. There are plenty of people doing it. The thing that I'm very struck by is that nobody ever talks about this in architecture schools. They just don't talk about it at all, as if it didn't exist. It's very, very peculiar. It's very, very peculiar to have a profession where the entire past of it is just wiped out and you're left to learn about it for yourself, really. It's a very odd thing to do. It's almost as if architects were like doctors who are fighting the diseases of the 1930s when they got a whole lot of new ones to fight.
Yeah, well, it's always struck me how little conversation there is, both in education and especially in practice, about why you build something a particular way, about the theory, effectively, about saying why are we doing this way, why are we doing that way, not just let's do this way and end of conversation.
It's very odd, isn't it? It doesn't. You're better qualified than me in that you've heard about it more recently. We held a debate at the Kent School of Architecture recently where we wanted to raise some of these points precisely. What sort of things should we be doing and why? Now, we were talking more about general attitudes because it's the first discussion in the series, as opposed to specific design processes, that's for sure. But what I noticed, I wasn't very surprised by this, but what I noticed was that those students, mostly second-year students in the audience, 2 or 3 of them said, how come we don't know about all this stuff? How come we don't have the words to describe these historical types and processes? And they're right, of course. It's not, and the reason why they don't is because all those things were taken off reading lists. You never see almost never see, it's very rare to see on a reading list for a design project, it's very rare to see anything that's even about the details of vernacular architecture. It just isn't in there, even though in practice most building is the alteration. Most architects' work consists of altering something that already exists, or building in an existing streetscape of some sort. That's where most work is. And that was methodically destroyed in architecture schools. John Outram tells a story about how he arrived at the Regent Street Polytechnic, what is now the University of Westminster, in the 1950s, and he was told by the head of the school, I think, that they had abolished all reading. They had thrown away all the books because architecture was about providing a technological solution to something, and everything else was a nonsense or a distraction. It was rubbish, that must be hidden. Exactly the Gothic Revival, an enemy that must be destroyed. A totally Gothic Revival attitude to it. And it took him a long time to be able to build up the kind of reading that interested him, mostly ethnographical in his case and anthropological and so on, and about symbolism and all these things. It took him a long time to get there because the books had actually been removed and destroyed from the libraries. I had a very enjoyable moment at the beginning, just a couple of weeks ago, when I started to write the brief for the second-year design project at my school. I simply selected all and deleted the entire accumulated reading list. And why does anybody need to know what Kenneth Frampton said? It's like 30 years later, 40 years later. We aren't there anymore. It's not, although it's interesting from a historical point of view to know what theoretical arguments they had in 1928, not really the thing that you necessarily should be giving priority to in your second year, when there is a whole lot more.
Do you still have a pattern language on your reading list?
Well, I never did. It had a kind of culty... I left it on as a curiosity. I divided it into 3 categories, into books that students must read. Well, these are standard university categories for reading lists. It's to do with how many copies they order, essentially. That's why they do it. But they have 3 categories. One is called must read, one is should read, and one is could read. I left 3 books for this project, which is it's what we now call collective dwelling. It's a housing scheme, essentially. And I left 3 books in must read, and the 3 books in must read were the Brunskill's book of vernacular architecture, Gordon Cullen's new townscape, concise townscape, and Peter Katz's book on new urbanism, not because it's particularly great, but because it's particularly relevant to this project. That's why that was there. Then I had a group of, say, 6 could reads, where I've said to people, have a go at reading, at least looking at 2 or 3 of these, and some of those are about particular historical building types, and some of them are, for example, Stephen Proctor and Andrew Matthews' book about their own housing. I've left into that category. And then there's a lot of stuff that you could, if you feel like it. You've got half an hour to fill, and you're in the library, and why not have a look? And I left the pattern language in there. I never really liked it. It was very big when I was a student in the early 80s, and it had to me a kind of creepy cult feeling to it, which gave me the...
I was flicking through my copy of it again the other day and realising how useful it could have been had I actually paid more attention to it at the time.
True. Yeah, I might have cheated myself out of an education, but I don't know. That's where my own anti-puritanical thing came. There's these rules, you must do this, you must do that. Really? You don't have to.
Yeah, that's true.
I can see why you might want directions of different kinds in designing a building, but there are plenty of other ones out there.
Yeah, but no, I agree with you about the state of sort of theory in architectural education. It wasn't until certainly after undergraduate and well into sort of postgraduate, that I actually got properly into theory and started to think really about why it is that we're building the things that we're building. But again, sort of going back to the contemporary state of affairs for a second, if we've been through, obviously, in the 70s and 80s, the postmodernist reaction to modernism. And then things have sort of reverted and then just sort of trundled along since then. And now there's this new conversation with the government's new Building Beautiful Commission,
Yes.
and appointing Sir Roger Scruton and to lead a commission. What are your thoughts on how that might play out, and how the architectural profession can react to it or engage with it, or what direction should the conversation be going in terms of how architectural theory and practice develop from here?
The appointment of Roger Scruton is to that organisation is, I think, somewhat less important than the newspapers made it out to be. I don't know how much notice people will take of it. There is an idea, which I've heard from more than one person, which is that the government didn't really know how controversial it was. It's clearly a name they knew from conservative circles, I suppose. But whether it will actually make any difference is rather hard to imagine. And I noticed actually rather in a slightly sad way, the minister was saying only recently, I think it's been in the AJ today, or certainly recently, that it wasn't supposed to be controversial. It was supposed to be something that attracted people's interest and attention and gave great value to a high-quality building. And actually, for all we might say about our politicians at the moment, I'm quite prepared to believe that. I think that probably is the case. They didn't really pick up the whole package of it.
Do you think there's a sort of sensitivity because of what happened in the 80s with Prince Charles and all that kind of thing?
Yeah,
there's almost like the profession got burned recently and it doesn't want to get burned again, maybe.
Yes, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think Prince Charles behaved very badly in the 1980s. I don't think you can really have a head of state doing all-out attacks on entire professions like that. It seems to me to be what you might call very unprofessional and unhelpful, really. Don't think it achieved anything very much. I remember at that time getting on a bus. I was working just off the western end of Westbourne Grove, and I got on the bus that goes down round the corner to Notting Hill, and on the bus, sitting next to me on those seats that faced each other in the old Routemasters, was Hugh Casson, nonetheless, who was one of my heroes. And Hugh Casson was writing in a notebook, which in those days I had good enough eyesight to be able to see, and he wrote, "The Prince is right in what he says, but wrong in the way that he says it." And I think that was true of him then, and I think it's still true now. I think getting involved in the Chelsea Barrack scheme in that way was a shocking thing to do. But when he could perfectly well have done it in a completely transparent public way, and everybody would have been the better for it, but he didn't. There's always a slight sense that he's going over the heads of, or round the back of, the architectural profession in order to make a headline. He's clearly a one-off, isn't he? He's not any kind of general phenomenon. It's just a one person with an interest in it who doesn't seem to know quite the most effective way of getting the results that he might want to get. You can't underestimate some of the positive aspects of it in his own. He had a school for a bit, didn't he? He still has an architectural foundation. Does a lot of very good work. Architecture is very valuable stuff. There is absolutely no reason why all architects shouldn't know about traditional ways of building and use them when in the situations that they think are right for them. You can't ever, I think, attack anyone for having knowledge of some kind about how buildings work and how they stand up. And it was able to make an argument for a sustainable environment argument for certain types of historic buildings. Sometimes those things are not completely proven, I don't think, to any great extent. But nevertheless, he was doing it, and it's a thing worth hearing. That's not entirely the same as the other things that were going on at the same time. The postmodernism of the 1980s, I don't know. I should know by now, but I don't really know. But I've always suspected that there was, on the part of some of those prominent postmodern architects of the 1980s, a sense of wanting to annoy the Puritans a bit, I think, probably. I think that I think you'd need to ask Sir Terry Farrell whether he would actively say that, but I think it might have been there somewhere. I have spoken to Piers Goff about where was it coming from, and he said he did. You can see. My impression is that he was very happy to hear the criticism of it. I think it's the most tactful way I can put it. It didn't bother him that people didn't like it. But that's not really where it was coming from. He liked American pop art. He said, the raunchy kind. He liked Alan Jones rather than Roy Lichtenstein. He loved that kind of thing. He found commercial clients who liked it as well. So he could prove that it was a perfectly viable way of designing a building as well as an enjoyable way of designing a building. He was enjoying himself. They were enjoying themselves, those people. It's worth stressing what a rarity that was in the 1980s, when everyone was going around po-faced and looking fed up with everything and blaming everything they could think of on Mrs. Thatcher. They, usually correctly, but it isn't anything to do with the design of a building, is it? Whether someone likes Mrs. Thatcher or not, I don't think.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You see, I think you're right. There'll always be people who enjoy just annoying, like you say, the Puritans or the critics.
Yes, love it.
And you see the House for Essex and Charles Holland and Grayson Perry strikes me as a prominent recent example of that, of going so completely the opposite way.
Yeah.
And so outrageous just for the sake of it, effectively.
Oh, I don't know. Yes, I mean, it was obviously a very striking collaboration, and it's obviously part of Grayson Perry's work that he does a kind of living performance, and his building should be part of that performance. That seems to me to be right. I doubt very much that there's in fact, I'm quite sure there is no element of provocation on Charles Holland's case, because, as I mentioned a moment ago, he knows his history really well. Better, I think, than any architect I've ever met. Has an astonishingly thorough and complete and almost Pugin-like range of knowledge about historical building. And designers are designers, and they don't tend to calculate these things when they're designing, but it's obviously in there somewhere, which makes buildings such as Charles's very enjoyable to analyse and to describe, because they go on giving in the many references they have to architectural traditions. He's really, I'm sure there are others, but of those whom I have met, Charles is really an outstanding example of an architect who has complete grasp of this history. He must have got it himself, because he won't have had it in his architectural education. We were, not just when I was here, but when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, which was 79 to 82, the thing that's more striking than anything else, I still think to this day that's really bizarre, is that there we were in a town full of fabulous old buildings, and you were not allowed to make any reference to any part of any of them when you were talking about what you were designing yourself. But when I say really? You were not allowed, you were looked on by pity, with pity, as being somebody kind of stupid. There were things going on to stir up a bit. The phenomenologists were taking off. I was taught by Peter Carl in my second year, which was a very enjoyable and worthwhile experience, even though it was a bit foreign to me. And I think probably if I'd been more grown up, I'd have made more of it. But Peter Butler Jones described the school at that time as being a battleground between the positivists and the phenomenologists, and it certainly felt like that. And they certainly wound each other up, for sure they did, and it certainly had an unpleasant effect on the students. But the phenomenologists weren't talking about history either. Nobody was. It's only latterly that they started to do it. I just find it very, very odd that when you're completely surrounded by a continuing development of history, that you just pretend it wasn't there. And that comes a bit out of the way in which modernist writers write about modernism, as if you're just having one conceptual brainstorming after the rest. But it's too far detached from what design and building involves.
Was that perhaps a difference between sort of early modernism and late modernism or contemporary modernism, in that context is now becoming more important and people are making reference, even if they're
they have to, right? They have to.
Yeah.
Now, that I said right at the start, the Gothic Revival came about because architects had to respond to the fact that they needed to be accurate in specification and in design. They had to be, for what you might call professional liability reasons, or they were going to be out of a job. They had to. And that has happened to architects who had to become more responsive to historic environments, because the conservation lobby in Britain gets stronger and stronger. And that means that you don't have any choice. You have to be able to respond to it accurately or you won't get the job. That means that if you're building in a conservation area or if you're altering a listed building, you are going to have to be extremely aware. Standards of building conservation and of architects working with a great deal of building conservation in their everyday work is enormously high in this country. The whole conservation framework, from the legislation to the amenity societies and their various activities, is incredibly sophisticated compared to most countries. You can, in England, get hold of a whole string of experts on one particular aspect of, for example, Victorian or, 1950s design with great ease compared to most other countries, including other Anglophone countries, although, in fact, the Commonwealth Anglophone countries have many similarities. It seems to be an Anglo-Saxon thing, this amenity society thing. But you can, it's very sophisticated, and so therefore if you're working in those situations, and many people working in towns are in those situations, then they have to be much more aware of it than they were. The buildings that we think about are, of course, a tiny minority of what actually gets built. A great majority of what actually gets built is somewhere off the radar of all that.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that in your book, don't you? I mean, you talk about the sort of how most things that get built are pretty average or not very good.
They always have been.
Yeah, which would make sense. Like if you assume a normal distribution of architectural ability, say, then most things are going to be average.
Yeah.
But how do we? So what's relevant to most people is that sort of bulk of average design. Like, and yes, you're right. You and I and the architect profession sees a lot of media coverage of all the high-profile buildings, the really good top-quality ones. But how do we bring up the general level of quality of everything else, of all the ones that are less good or average? Like, how does that
first of all, I'm not sure that. Yes, it has happened, and it tends to be in fairly centralised or homogeneous systems. The general standard of Scandinavian type house building in Britain in the 1950s was pretty high. But these things go drastically out of fashion. You can find no shortage of people, and the Prince of Wales is one of them, who thinks that all Georgian terraced housing is wonderful. People didn't think that from about 1840 right through till about 1920. You'd be pretty hard pushed to find anybody who thought that. They thought that they were ugly and boring. You know, Pugin grew up in those streets, just didn't want it. Or even want to know about it. So the fashions come and go, and you can't do anything about that. What you can do something about is the actual technical quality. The technical quality of housing in the 1950s doesn't really match up to what we expect now. That means that all the windows have been replaced and this, that, and the next thing has gone wrong with them. And then they go out of fashion again, but it will come back. Good ordinary buildings, good ordinary architecture has always been a kind of the holy grail, hasn't it? Everyone wants it. Don't have to be special. The main reasons why what the terrible word iconic makes architects cringe is because of this idea that certainly students have, that their building has to have what they call a concept, stand out in some way, and it really doesn't, by which I'm not saying I'm like repressing geniuses and telling them to design boring terraced houses, because that's not my position to do. But you should certainly learn how to walk before you can run, I would say. It is very difficult. In England, it's been enforced mainly through building regulations, pretty tough on the whole. It was done in England traditionally through the Building Acts. And every now and then there were problems one way or another. The period I've been studying most recently, which is the Edwardian period, is dominated by rows about the building bylaws, that's to say the building regulations as applied locally, which was the case then, because they were so restrictive that they wouldn't allow people to build in the old building materials of the countryside, essentially. So you get landowners in 1900 saying, I've got these beautiful thatched cottages and I want to give them kitchens and bathrooms, and they want me to build a thing that looks like a piece of public housing, it was sort of public housing, a brick extension, because that's the only thing the building regulations will allow. But by and large, building regulations have been perfectly reasonable and built buildings up to a reasonable standard. How you arrive at, what Bleak Houses says is that the way to arrive, what I'm proposing in that, and it can't be anything other than a hypothesis, I think, is that the way to improve the general standard is by having a much more informed and intelligent way of talking about buildings in the first place. Because if architects are talking about buildings in conceptual terms, in intellectual terms, it's not much use to anybody else, really. It's not any useful way of communicating, and there has to be a common language across everybody in order for more people to take an interest in building, an informed interest in building, and for building to improve. Yeah. One story I am very struck by, which I recorded in that, was that a student of mine called Adam Summerfield, who was one of the early students at the Kent School of Architecture, who was talking about how a large international practice put an exhibition on in Chatham of a big dockside development, and the drawings were fantastic and they were beautifully drawn, and it was full of renders that you'd think anyone could understand and so on, and it was met with incredulity and some degree of annoyance from the locals. And what Adam said was, I think it's a very profound thing really, which is that if you can talk about what these buildings are, rather than try and show them in flashy pictures, talk about them in story terms almost, about what they're meant to recall, or what they're meant to remind you of, or what it is that they promise. If you can do that, then you can communicate with more people. If you make more of a story about what buildings are about, you might get over the problem that the great majority of people who use buildings are just not able to read drawings or be particularly sympathetic to them, and certainly need not have any interest in the theory behind it. What they want to know is, what is it? There's nothing patronising about that. Everybody likes stories. There's stories of all different kind of levels of sophistication. And that, I think, is really important, to find a way of talking about buildings. Enormously important. It's always going to be the job of the designer to be the designer, but the position of the designer in society is really the result of the level of communication going on between the two.
Yeah, you say that if you say that Adam Sutherland suggested that non-architects might understand architects' ideas better if they heard the story behind them and understood the kind of world the designers were trying to create in literary terms, rather than through an exhibition of drawings and sophisticated animations.
Yes, and it's worth pointing out something that comes as a shock to us, or can come as a shock to architects, which is that great majority of people don't understand the drawings, don't even understand elevations, really.
Well, do you think technology has a role to play in that, like with the rise of VR and 3D and that kind of thing?
Yeah, all those things can only be a good thing. Absolutely, those things.
But do we need to sort of give people more access to that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think do. One of the something that's very striking about the changes in technology is the big role it plays in building conservation. One of the ironies is that it's very often building conservation people, or people who deal with it regularly from an architectural point of view, who are in fact using the most exciting and innovative building technology. Jonathan Deeming is the surveyor of the fabric of Canterbury Cathedral. He came to talk to us about how that 12th century glass was reset in a new stone window. The only way, the glass of course had distorted over the last 700 years or whatever it was, and so building a flat plane of a piece of window tracery wasn't going to help. The only way in which you could work out how to do it was by scanning the individual bits of glass, and by creating from that the template for the mullions, because there wasn't any other way in which you could do it. In fact, couldn't measure anything more accurately and put it together without using that type of technology. So although of course it's true that that of course is, well, that's scanning technology, that's slightly different, but those type of visualizations being used very often in complicated, mostly new buildings like the roof of the British Museum Court and that kind of thing, of course relating to an old building worth remembering, but they have great application, I think, in building conservation and in building in historic environments, and they are interesting things to use, and architects like gadgets, and so they should. If it makes the job go better, then you should do it. So there shouldn't ever be any sense that people who are working in conservation or people who are working in historic building are some kind of fuddy-duddy, because it clearly isn't true. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that there you sort of focus on that particularly British idea of an idea of conservation and of sort of architectural history. And one of the things that the housing minister said recently that struck me as interesting was he wants architects to create the conservation areas of the future. And I sort of think, well, can you think of any developments that might meet that, like say Arcadia in Cambridge or something? Will that, in 100 years' time, will there be someone scanning that and putting a 2-star listing on it or anything like that? And what is it that will make a conservation area of the future?
Well, that's a very good question to ask at the moment, because Historic England is exactly considering all these things. We, at the 20th Century Society, carried out a pilot study on the protection of conservation areas. It's an area which is underexplored. You can see the terrible rash of plastic windows. It gives you one reason as to why it's important, because if those areas aren't protected, their character changes completely. And things that seemed normal but high quality can very quickly become a mess when there's no control over it whatsoever. What is certainly the case, it's not surprising that it's happening, and I think in a way it's not unreasonable that it's happening, is that Historic England has to take into account more and more aspects of the value of a building. So therefore, the community value of a building, for example, could be as important as the architectural value. The architectural value is of interest to a very small number of people. The community value is of interest to a lot of people. I'll give you a very good example of that, actually. There was a pair of architects called Seeley and Paget, at whose expense I've had a lot of fun in one way or another, because they were terrible designers. They obviously employed some decent people, but they themselves couldn't design their way out of a paper bag. The buildings were just terrible, and they did a lot, though, because they were both of them very well connected socially. And they were, for example, diocesan surveyors to the Diocese of London after the war. There were a lot of churches. They did a good one in Stevenage, but most of them are just awful. They designed a church in Tottenham, St John the Baptist, which was under threat recently, and one of the local residents put in an application to have the building listed, and approached me to write something in favour of the listing. Now, all I'd ever done is say what terrible architects these were and how terrible their buildings were. And in fact, in Bleak houses, I actually showed that building as an example of one of their terrible buildings. Now I'm in a situation where I have to say that it's worth keeping, even though it's useless. Now, the argument that it's so useless it's quite funny is an argument that we might enjoy, but Historic England, which has political accountability, can't really use that as a way of preventing a developer from doing something. What you can say for sure about that building, though, is that it's a major landmark, and really the only significant landmark, on the A10, on the Great Cambridge Road that runs down the middle of the road. When you see that building, you know you've arrived in Tottenham. It stands out like anything. It's very distinct. And it is, in community terms, it is genuinely a building of significance to that area and the people who live around there. And if it got compromised in some way, but there was an application not to demolish it, but to mess it up, really, blunt it, then the architectural landmark for Tottenham goes. That's a perfectly relevant argument. Seems to me a perfectly reasonable argument to make, and certainly, I was surprised, but maybe I should have been, that Historic England evidently accepted the community argument and did indeed list the building.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting point, and I mean, I think about the same thing with the old Birmingham Library, and that perhaps the more outrageous the building is, the more people know about it and the more conversation there is. But then you get this sort of polarization between people who really love it despite how it looks, or maybe they particularly like the way that it does look, and then everyone else who really hates it but still likes it as a community asset.
Yeah, it's difficult. For something like Historic England, it's quite difficult. Those situations crop up all the time. That's one of them, obviously. There's a very good example of one, in fact, where what you might call most people didn't like it. So it's right for the conservation movement to be perpetually challenged and on its toes, to look for good reasons to keep buildings which are not obviously appealing to other people. It's right. It's one of the reasons why conservation is such a high level, or the conservation debate in Britain is at such a high level, is because those of us involved in it do have to look for as many different arguments as we possibly can in order to justify keeping a building.
Well, I think we're talking now about the sort of, again, the more prominent landmark kind of buildings, but on a more sort of local level, like I think what the housing minister means is sort of the conservation areas of nice villages or like nice Georgian townscapes, or somewhere like Kensington or Chelsea or Cotswold Village, or somewhere that people think has a general architectural value that is worth preserving. and retaining the quality of? And how do you get that on a more urban level in a whole way, rather than as an individual building that maybe does have a lot of community value?
Yes, it's very difficult. We had a case came up of a building designed by my cousin Leonard Manasseh on the other side of the road from Kensington and Chelsea Town Hall. This was a conservation area, and we applied to list it because the building was under threat. In fact, the porch, the best bit of the building actually, or one of the best bits of it, which was its staircase, had very quickly been removed by the developer to ensure that the building wasn't worth keeping. Now, we said our argument to Kensington and Chelsea was, this is a conservation area, so how did you let them completely change the appearance of the front of the building? To which they said, oh, it's not a conservation area because of your house, it's a conservation area because of all the big Victorian houses round about. Well, that isn't how it should work. It either is a conservation area or if it isn't. If it is one, then every house in it, whatever it is, has to be considered protected unless a strong argument is made. Otherwise, it's a sign of how things have changed, that I don't know what was built there in the end, but the application at the time was to build replica Victorian pair of semi-detached houses onto the site of a 1950s Festival of Britain style house.
Yeah. Well, I think coming on to again one of your quotes about leading into style again. You say, whole divisions of architectural style have never been through a process of intelligent criticism or debate. The awkward high Victorian provincial classical and the cheap mid-20th century almost Tudor are firmly in that category. It is not surprising, therefore, that the results are not very good. Indeed, the buildings are clumsy, incompetently derivative and badly judged. And do you think, in terms of, again, that sort of the need for a theoretical or critical debate about architecture, is that true of current architecture, that because we're not having that conversation?
No, we aren't having that conversation. I think it might be slowly coming back, and there are people who can do it. I refer again to Charles Holland does do it. So it is, and I'm sure as a teacher he does it. In fact, I know as a teacher he does it, and there are other people who do it as teachers too. But it needs a lot more work. I talked there about early 20th century Tudor. Now, the Tudor is a thing that keeps on coming back in English architecture, however much critics hate it, which they do. Nevertheless, it keeps on coming back, and most of the houses, a couple of them are illustrated in there, I think. The houses near me, gone up completely Tudor-looking buildings. Tudor comes back again at the moment. The latest excuse for doing it is that you can build timber-framed buildings the way the Tudors did, in a perfectly reasonable, logical and feasible way, so why not? And people like them anyway, and so on. Now, when in the Edwardian revival of Tudor architecture that was going on late 1890s up to the First World War, in that period there is a lot of very intelligent debate about it, and that's why it's so good. The place where most of the intelligent debate was going on was in the magazine Country Life, in fact, which knew and illustrated and analysed a continuous stream of 16th and early 17th century houses, so that people reading it would know really well what the qualities and the references were in buildings of this kind. So it was perfectly reasonable that you get this enormous increase in Tudor-looking buildings. Many of them, not all, obviously, there's only a limited number of good designers at any one moment, but the very high general standard of Tudor building types in that period. You don't get that, really, after the First World War, partly because the normal fashion thing, that people are fed up with that now, and now they want something else, mostly Georgian, I suppose, from even before the First World War onwards. They're not talking about it anymore. And the Tudor references get thinner and meaner as you make your way through the 20s and 30s. But yet people adored all those neo-Tudor 1930s houses, however cheap they were.
What do you think that appeals? Does that appeal to the British sort of sense of history, or almost an idealising of the medieval and this kind of thing?
Yeah, not so much the medieval, more the Tudor thing. That thing keeps on coming back and back because it's Protestant and it's sort of. There's an argument which I'm trying to make in what I'm doing at the moment, and I'm not entirely sure how to tie it together, but just about everything in English politics is to do with control of land. The House of Lords is the landowners, or was. That's the point of it, was that it was the landowners. And landowners' rights appear in pretty much everything right up until the 1947 Act. That's the significance of the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, is that the conversation becomes about something else rather than who owns the land and what can we persuade them to do with it. That's basically the thing that changes. And in broad political terms, the Liberal Party, which was the party of government for much of the time in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Liberal Party is a party of land reform. That's to say, it believes in breaking up the powers of landowners in different ways, not necessarily extremely radical ways, but different ways of tempering the extraordinary control that landowners had over almost everything on their own property, and indeed still do in the area around here. And therefore, the symbolism of Tudor is very appropriate for this, because it has a kind of rural, pre-industrial look to it. It also has something which fine Georgian architecture didn't necessarily have, which it looks a bit as if anyone could do it, doesn't it? It looks like in your own carpentry shop, you ran up the timber frame for your building and you screwed it together. It has a kind of Mr. Or Mrs. Everyman sense.
Well, it's sort of, especially the contemporary iterations, the closest thing I can really think of to a pattern book in the old sense.
Yeah.
Of where you have a set layout or a set of details and kind of things, and any vaguely competent contractor can put it together.
Yeah, or you can yourself, like Walter Siegel's was.
Exactly, yeah.
They were timber frame buildings. So there's something about timber frame aspect of Jacobean building. But not only that, I mean, the rest of it maybe comes by connotation, but there's something about timber frame which has kind of everyman character to it, that everyone can do it. Everyone, it looks like you made it and it belongs to you, and it makes you identify with the land from which you came, which is a kind of act of revolt against Tory landowners, I suppose, is how they would have seen it. One of the most interesting things that goes on, many interesting things go on related to this in the first decade of the 20th century. One of them is the conversion of barns and agricultural buildings into genteel, what the people in that area call polite houses. Mrs. Asquith, the Prime Minister's wife, converts a barn into a house, for example. Now, she's a person who talks all the time about herself and her family and her ideas. She doesn't say anything at all about this dramatic thing that she's just done. It must have in some way seemed to her a reasonable thing to do as a person right absolutely, by definition, at the heart of the liberal establishment. It's going on all over the place. There's a kind of reclaiming of typically English building structures is going on at that time. So Tudor does all that. Tudor satisfies all those things. It's also very sensible. I say in that book that you could perfectly well tell the story of functionalism by looking at Elizabethan and Tudor timber frame buildings, some which are astonishing, aren't they? Like Little Morton Hall.
Yeah, no,
you could do it.
Incredible.
Yeah, I mean, there you have a modular timber frame construction. If you were so inclined, you could tell the story of modernism like that. But they're not those kind of people, the modernism people. The modernism people are essentially classical people, and they like going back down to their 18th century French
let them
theory.
hear you say that.
Yeah, all that stuff. That's what they like. They like all that and golden proportion and this, that. And the next thing is what they talk about. That's because modernism hasn't got anything whatsoever to do with function, which by now everybody has realised. It doesn't, does it? And what kind of function is this? Function of the 1920s factory.
Yeah.
It's no use to anyone else.
But how do we translate, or first of all, should we translate that kind of, that sense of not a sense of the bucolic, but a more of a connection to the land, if you want to put it simply. How can you or should you translate that into a more urban context in mass housing schemes these days? And where's the value that can be extracted and put into contemporary housing schemes, and where should we sort of move on from that?
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? There was a time in the 80s when a lot of people, I remember Michael Manser, the then president of the RIBA, saying this, that by the time the council, the county and the district road officers have been all over your housing scheme, it's very difficult to to anything that looks reasonable from a street point of view, because all the dominant bits that are outside the houses are all being controlled by somebody else. And that's what the American new urbanism was about, wasn't it? It was trying to get the road engineers out of the center of the scheme. It's possible to do it. The designers of Radburn layouts knew that it was possible to separate the road business from the urban business. You have one outside the other. It's very difficult. A lot of the things to do with housing are really to do with the nuts and bolts of the housing market, aren't they, really, in truth? Because if people don't have enough incentives to buy a house, then they won't, and that means convenient this, that, and the next thing. Why? That's what you'd expect, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're spending all that money, you might as well. And also desperate. I mean, the point was made today to me by Terry Farrell, which is that very often there is a market for badly designed houses because people are just desperate for housing, full stop.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's perhaps an idea that, certainly in the new commission that the government's launched, that if you make people really like the buildings that are proposed, that they are beautiful, then they'll be sort of magically get sort of sail through planning, and then suddenly we'll be able to build 300,000. And maybe that's a factor, but I'm struggling to see how much that is a factor and how much it is just a very minor part of the equation.
I think they probably do think that. I wouldn't be surprised if Sir Roger Scruton thought that they'd be so obviously so much nicer that everybody will want them. But that's what people think about Georgian houses. We just know that wasn't true. Or through the 19th century, they couldn't think of anything more disgusting than the houses that are around here. It's the ugliest thing that there could possibly be. This mass-produced flat houses. It didn't matter that they were built, perhaps sometimes quite well according to the London Building Acts. They were the people who hated them just hated them, whether it was rational or irrational, whatever it was. So there isn't going to be any answer to that, I don't think. I don't think you can do it, or at least you can't plan it. It's dependent on so many different things, really. It's very difficult designing large amounts of housing.
Yeah, well, it's one of the points that Paul Finch made at one of the events the other day about this was that the collapse in local authority building has been from his point of view, was the predominant factor in the collapse of house building generally.
Yeah, it's right.
And that sort of got me thinking, what's the appropriate role of the state, either at a national level or at a local authority level, in terms of what gets built and what it looks like?
Well, to give an illustration of what Paul was saying, Odham's Walk in Long Acre in Covent Garden was one of the very last housing developments of the GLC. And what is often said, you should go and have a look at it, go in daylight. Okay. I think they may actually shut it to non-residents. In fact, I think you're not meant to go there for non-residents anyway, but you can during the daylight. That housing estate, which is quite a high-density housing estate, was designed at the very tail end of public housing before Mrs. Thatcher finished it off. And what is sometimes said, and it may be a bit starry-eyed, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was true, is that at that point, the GLC architects had essentially solved the problem of housing. They got it completely right. There isn't anything wrong with it. You can't expect something to be perfect for all time in all conditions, and no doubt there are things that don't fit now and won't work and the rest of it. But given human imperfection, by the end of their existence, the GLC was producing very high quality housing. The politically conservative objection to that was the idea that the state would know better than you did what kind of house you should live in. Well, I would say, but then I'm an architect, so I would, that the state should know better than the average person what sort of house they should live in. It's pretty obviously the case. It's a matter of your professional reputation, isn't it? That you are better than they are.
Yeah, I find it strange that sort of in any other market, say, you have high quality products and low quality products, and people choose them based on their preferences and on the quality, and that just doesn't seem to exist in housing. Like there isn't. There's no premium for a high quality house. It's all entirely based on location and size and demand, effectively.
Yeah.
And therefore
it's not even based on area. When you look in the estate agents in other countries, they always tell you in big letters what the area of the unit is that they're selling, whereas here they never do and never have done. And I didn't know what the area of my house was until I had to apply for planning permission to change it. People don't, on the whole, know. Whereas you ask a Swiss or a German, they will tell you my flat is 59.83 square meters.
Yeah.
It is fairly irrationally done. Everything to do with land in England is different. It's just this very long history of land ownership being the main thing in every possible discussion about architecture and land in England all the time. Endlessly, it comes back to the same thing: land control. Mrs. Thatcher didn't want local authorities taking on the liability and responsibility of being big landowners. Their council house business, the Labour Party had been selling council houses before she turned up. The difference was that she was actively trying to divest local authorities of that type of liability in order to reduce their costs and their budgets and so on. That's what she was up to. Not for me to judge whether she should or she shouldn't, but that's the thing that she was at. And so she wanted the public authorities out of it. The current situation is catastrophic. We don't yet know what caused the Grenfell fire, and it may well be that it isn't anything to do with the structure of Kensington Chelsea Borough Council. But what we do know is there would once have been a time when the fire officer, the building inspector and the planner would have been together in the room and looked at it all together, rather than everything being relegated out beyond the reach of any normal kind of accountability. And it could be, I don't know, but it could be that played a role in that.
Yeah.
The situation was just too complicated that for anyone to have any oversight over it.
Yeah. No, I think the sort of the idea that design and build contracts, for example, and the need for value engineering is degrading the quality of architecture. I think there's general agreement on that. But if I can take it sort of back 100, 200 years, why, when you had entrepreneurs building large Victorian or Georgian estates out across the fields of expanding London, what was it that made them make the buildings the level of quality they are and not even cheaper?
They had to. The building acts, the building bylaws. They couldn't make them. Sometimes they did. I mean, I remember asking in naivety, how was it that in Somerstown, on the site of St Pancras Station, there were all these slums? How was it possible that they were built? Well, the answer was the landowner was also the magistrate. So the landowner was the same person to whom you would have come to say that his own houses weren't meeting the building regulations, and he wasn't bothered, evidently. So the bylaws, I should say. It was the high standard, but this is also related to land ownership. It's because of the control of the landowners that England didn't have any kind of centralised planning whatsoever until 1947. Until 1910, every time a town wanted to make an improvement, it had to have a separate Act of Parliament. That's what happened. And 1910 enables councils to do this, or enables them to create a system in which they can do it. It's not until 1947 that you can actually do it without having an Act of Parliament. So so there's a long history. Now, because you couldn't carry out planning reforms, what you could do in England was improve building standards. After the Great Fire of London, as you know, people come up with their great schemes for a huge modern city, and it obviously doesn't happen because it's not feasible or reasonable for Parliament to pass hundreds of acts of Parliament to reorganise the land ownership. It just can't do it. They build King Street and Queen Street in the City of London, almost nothing else. But what they do is they start to introduce increasingly high standards of building regulations, mainly to prevent, of course, fire spreading from building to building through the structure or along the front. So England reacts. It can't react with planning, but it reacts through the building legislation. So that means that, by and large, however cheap the houses were, they still had to meet an average certain level of
I think
standard.
There's, I suspect, general agreement that the building regulations are overall a good thing, and maybe there's sort of a maximum maximum limit of complexity that maybe you need to settle them for practical reasons. But I'm sort of more interested in at what level should there be a design check or design quality standards set? Should that be within the building regulations, or should it be at planning level done by local authorities or dictated by local authorities, or should it be advised to local authorities by, say, local design boards? Like, at what point and to what degree should the state or the local authority have an input into what is designed, what it looks like, what its sort of style it is, what what the design quality is judged
Well, that's
against.
gone. That's kind of almost gone, hasn't it? The local authorities are so shrunk that they don't have it anymore. Now, when it existed, of course, I need hardly tell you, and you won't be surprised to hear, that architects railed all the time against design control was the expression, it still is the expression, but design control was a much bigger thing in the days when a local authority would say, we don't want any red pantar roofs in this whole street. And that doesn't really happen anymore, does it? But that did happen once, and it was used as a way of maintaining certain standard that the English were not particularly interested in putting up with. If you look at the level of homogeneity in, I don't know, Danish suburbs, for example, it's because there are kind of official good taste arbiters deciding what everything has to look like centrally that maintain it. It's not because they're somehow fundamentally different. There were good things and there were bad things. There were some very distinct advantages to the British planning system. For example, the one thing the British planning system was determined to stop at all costs, and has done, is people building in the middle of nowhere or on the fringes of towns. You don't ever get a situation in England that you get in Italy, where one town just drags on to become the next one. Don't you? And most countries have this. But the British planning system, which was also adopted in the Middle East by Israel and Jordan, for example, you just don't have it. There's no great kind of advertising all over the place. There are big successes to British planning. It's very difficult to enforce design control, it seems to me. Again, it's an area where some kind of intelligent discussion about what is desirable and what is not is something worth having. But it is very difficult, always.
So is it possible to put a sufficient degree of good design guidelines into sort of almost regulations or to lighter level sort of design guides like the London Design Guides that bureaucrats or local authorities can understand and implement, rather than having... Yeah,
it has worked. The Essex Design Guide worked very well, in fact, I would say. I can't tell you what derision... I don't really remember when it was introduced, but I do remember, which I think was mid-70s or possibly even early 70s, but certainly remember people talking about it in the late 70s and early 80s as if this was some horror that had been introduced. On the whole, fairly benevolent effect, the Essex Design Guide, I think. It was an intelligent piece of work. And it was something that where they set out, that the county authority set out to create a level of design that people could respond to without knowing anything much about buildings. And that was very successful, I think.
Do you think the sort of the legislative or regulatory level is the appropriate level for that to happen, though? Because obviously my instinctive reaction to a document or a set of sort of bureaucrats saying you have to design this way is, who are you to tell me how I have to design things?
No, that was Mrs. Thatcher's argument. Who are you to tell me?
Yeah, but so should it happen?
Most people's argument is, who are you to tell me? The great majority of English people say, who are you to tell me? Yeah. That's exactly what they will think. That's not a winnable battle, I don't think. The only thing that is winnable is to have some kind of easily communicable way of talking about the qualities of building. That returns again to what we were saying before about storytelling and narratives and so on. I think the Essex Design Guide did that. I can't really see anything much wrong with it. It wasn't, it stops the great genius from the Bartlett designing their concrete tower block in the middle of an old village, but it would be in quite a small minority if that's what they wanted to do. All these things have got broad political connotations that you need to take a lot of people with you, whatever it is that you decide to do. Yeah. People don't mind. I mean, think how quickly people changed their front doors when they bought their council house.
Yeah. Well, is it the answer, therefore, perhaps more within architectural education itself, that if you sort of change the philosophy of architectural education to make architects not want to go out and be the big egotistical person putting a concrete block in the middle of nowhere, that's actually a more, a more sustainable, I guess, way of changing the problem, of fixing the problem.
I couldn't agree more. Architectural education has to change. There are many wonderful teachers in architectural education, so I'm not going to say that the architectural teaching profession is itself a problem. It's not that. It's just that there's a mountain of accumulated modernist junk which was invented in the 1950s and 60s and imposed on everyone and never really went away. The things that you see being built by not even especially, not particularly outstanding or famous architects, but just decent or reasonable architects, it's very hard to see what it is about them that could have come from architecture school, because there's no conversation of any sort whatsoever. Always repeatedly saying that it's very peculiar that there's no conversation whatsoever about historical traditions, except in the very narrow confines of history lectures, which, as you know, most designers switch off anyway and think it's just a thing they have to revise for their exams. It never seems to have any practical application to it whatsoever, and yet it should do. Be talking about all those things. You don't, knowing a lot about it doesn't mean that you're going to, there's a horror on the part of that particular generation who introduced all that stuff, that if people learnt about Georgian houses or they learnt about Tudor houses, then they're going to be designing Georgian houses or Tudor houses. This isn't true. There's no evidence that this is the case. You can get people, and mention Charles again, who has massive knowledge of architectural history, of different tastes, of different sorts, different things. It doesn't do anything that looks like it was designed 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Not even the very good classical people do things that look like they were designed 200 years ago either, and Craig Hamilton doesn't.
Yeah.
They're now his buildings. It comes out of the knowledge of it. It sits there in the back, and the brain in the creative person does the creative work.
But where does that horror come from? Why is there such a revulsion at even the mention of the possibility that you might learn something from history?
It's very strange. It's very peculiar. In my own school, we know that a lot of students go on to take good jobs in the big conservation practices in Purcell and Insel and so on. A lot do, actually. And I think to myself more and more, we need to prepare people. They can obviously do the jobs, so it's not as if there's a massive failure of any kind. I don't think that the kind of objective level of architecture education is bad at all. It's actually quite high, in fact. But the intellectual, cultural level of it is inadequate, I think. And those people should be going into their jobs knowing already, for example, what the names of the bits of building are that they're now going to have to be dealing with in the day job. No other profession would say you aren't even allowed to know it. No, it's mad, I think. It's very peculiar. It's very strange. It's not easily solvable. And I don't think that for once the RIBA is imposing any kind of problem here, because the RIBA requirements are very general indeed.
Well, is that maybe where the answer lies, in making the RIBA guidelines?
Any answer for anything lies in the RIBA.
So I'm curious about this, about the general skepticism that people sort of have towards the RIBA. It's
very disappointing very often, I think. The broadest feeling of annoyance with the RIBA is the way in which they let project managers come in and take over. Whether they could have prevented it, I don't know. But that's the thing that's happened, the collapse of the prestige of the architectural profession. Yeah. It's very strange.
Well, I've been struck as well, like reading some of the slightly older books on theory during part 3. Yeah. I've been struck by the lack of clerk of works as in almost any existence at all anymore in any projects.
No,
maybe on the largest ones.
They've gone. No, I mean, I'm not totally on the ball about modern contracts, but I'm not that bad, because I've had to read a lot of stuff for part 3 stuff recently. And that has all changed, hasn't it? It's completely changed. But the big thing was making the project manager, who's essentially just an administrator, in charge of all those decisions. I can see how it happened, but there may have been ways of countering it. You watch Grand Designs. One of the things that's very striking about Grand Designs is that the presenter almost never mentions the names of the architects. He had to on the recent series, because the recent series was about the RIBA House of the Year Award, so then he did. But he doesn't, by and large. It's as if they didn't really matter.
Well, that's because it's a program about stories, isn't it? It's about people. It's designed for the viewer who's dreaming about building their own house.
That's totally what it is. But it is quite odd to talk about them as if their role in it was so minor that you can just forget them. After all, it's only 1.5 seconds to say it in a program that lasts an hour. Yeah. And yet they almost never do they? Almost never.
No. Well, the other thing that struck me about Grand Designs is that it's the primary gateway by which most people in the country engage with architecture, probably, because it's what Channel 4's most popular program, or certainly one of its most popular programs, and that therefore the way that it's presented affects the way people perceive architecture. Yeah. And there's almost this. First of all, this binary set of, architecture is for rich people building houses in the countryside and having a child while doing it and going over budget and coming through in the end.
Disaster narrative.
Yeah. Yes. But it's and obviously it plays into the story in that sense. but there's no real criticism about the actual architecture itself. Like I was thinking, I was missing.
No, if you can, I did watch not this year's House of the Year, but last year's. I did watch most of them because I was interested in the fate of a couple of houses in it, and I was very struck by that. You can see why the presenter is the presenter. Obviously, has an engaging style that a lot of people like, and we know that's true because a lot of people do like it and a lot of people watch it. So he's doing his job correctly from his point of view, but he says nothing about the architecture. He says, wow, this is amazing, is what he says, basically, isn't it?
I mean, I think about programs like by Jonathan Meades, for example, and that kind of level of deep criticism of architecture.
That's very rare, though, isn't it?
It is very rare, but I think even the fact that existed at the time was something, and now nothing like that exists, really.
No, there isn't anybody doing it now. No, it isn't. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but the one architectural program from the BBC that everyone should watch is the John Betjeman film Metroland, which says a lot about architecture, in fact, as he makes his way from Baker Street out to the Verney Junction, which was the furthest the Metropolitan line ever got. It has happened, but they're very rare. There's always evidence everywhere that most people aren't really interested. But it is striking in the case of grand designs. It doesn't actually say anything about, I mean, obviously there isn't anything about the history of any particular type. There might be a bit, possibly, if you engage the architects a bit more, then there might be. But it doesn't by and large do it. It's not thought to be interesting or important enough to people.
Yeah. Well, that's probably true that it isn't interesting or important to the kinds of people who want to watch the kind of program that Grand Designs is. But then, because I remember the Culture Show on BBC Two used to do segments about architecture, like about particular buildings.
Rare, isn't it?
Again, but rare. Yeah.
The what's it called? Is it called Saturday Review? The arts program on Radio 4 Saturdays.
Never talks about buildings. They talk. The only time they do
is in the Sterling Prize.
But a prize is not a conversation about architecture, is it? Really, it's a conversation about that designer and that building.
Who's winning,
and who's winning, and it's only there anyway because it's a prize. And it's obviously not true that you can't talk about architecture on the radio. Pevsner did it.
Yeah, but has there ever been a proper public conversation about architecture? Though? Like, was it a prominent?
No, I wonder sometimes whether that was what Prince Charles thought he was doing. It's hard to tell. It's a strange, enigmatic character in many ways.
But like when the Gothic Revival was starting up, was there a prominent public conversation about it and about it going on?
There was more of one, and I say that having read a lot of the journalism of the period, is that there were several they were literary, cultural magazines in which they would quite regularly have decent articles about buildings and what they formed, what they were like, of all political colours. There were also, different Catholic ones or Church of England ones, but there were Conservative ones, there were Tory ones and Whig ones, as it were. The Edinburgh Review and all these, the Gentleman's Magazine. There certainly was. It depended a lot on very good writers, of course, which is not something you can conjure up out of anywhere. But if you went to the equivalent of those magazines today, which might be the Spectator and the New Statesman, perhaps, they don't. The Spectator doesn't have anybody.
Yeah, I keep an eye on the Spectator list because you're like music and cinema and all this kind of thing. And architecture is never there anymore. It just doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist anymore. And it's a shame. And there was once a thing called The Listener, which was that kind of magazine, but it was published by the BBC, and that talked quite a bit about architecture. It's a shame that all those things help. All those things would help a lot, actually.
But why is that? Why has it become like that? What's
hard to
happened?
say. One of the reasons why the readership of the Spectator is very keen on Roger Scruton, I suspect. If you read it, that's the impression you get. And the reason is that he's perhaps the only one that they've ever heard of, in fact. And if there were other people with different views, they might listen to them instead. And there aren't, so they don't.
Well, it seems strange to me because architecture is the one art, if you want to call it that, that you can't avoid. No one can avoid it at all. Like, you can't choose. You can choose to go and see a film. You can choose to go see a play. You can't choose to not see a building when you're walking past it. So it's, maybe it's to do with the timing or the nature of it or the fact that it's difficult to define, but it does seem very strange to me that there isn't that conversation.
Yeah, I don't know why there isn't.
Yeah.
It's a kind of big educational failure. The more marginalised architects get, the less they say in public too, I think, also.
Well, do architects need to be noisier, generally, in public?
It always usually ends in tears, doesn't it? And they try.
Perhaps, yes. Right, well, we'll call it a day in that case. Thank you very much, Tim, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Bruce.
This conversation will continue, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Great, good. That's perfect timing. Get the 5:50.